What is going on, everyone? Today, I want to talk about how to get what you want despite how you feel about something. In other words, how to get what you want despite your emotions. And for more on this, it's really just to act despite your emotions. We all feel them. Some of us let them control what it is that we do. And I have found that recognizing them, but then not letting them control what it is that I do, is actually most useful to get closer to what it is that I want. And this past week was a particularly emotional one, and I will explain, but it had me reflecting on how frequently people let their emotions dictate their actions. And as a result, their actions and their emotions dictate their outcomes. And I think this is an important one because when we feel them, it doesn't mean that something is wrong with us. If we, for example, feel anxiety or anger, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong, but it also doesn't mean that we have to act on the emotion that we feel. And so I'm going to tell a couple stories that happened this week that illustrate this really well. And I'm going to give you some frameworks that you can use to figure out how you can act despite what it is that you feel and not as a result of what you feel. But first, who am I? My name is Ryan Rice. I'm a full-time real estate investor. Last year, we did 7 figures. I share all of this stuff to document my own learnings and to transfer those learnings to you with the hopes that they're helpful. So the first situation that happened this week, there is someone I know that I talked to earlier in the week, and this person communicated to me that they had a lot of anxiety. There were things that happened in all different portions of this person's life that created this anxiety, and as a result, she was really feeling it, and it was impacting what it is that she wanted to accomplish. And so when she told me that, I shared with her my story of when I faced what I would call extreme anxiety, extreme uncertainty, and what I did to push through it. So I'll tell you that story very quickly. It was when, early in my investing career, I had 20 large construction projects, all going with one contractor, because why not? That's, of course, the smartest thing to do, is to give 20 jobs to one person. And I advanced that contractor a ton of money, which, again, is incredibly intelligent. Why wouldn't that be a good idea? Well, after I did that, that contractor pieced out, took the money with him, and I still have not seen any of that money. And then, after he pieced out with significant amounts of money, well over 6 figures, I went to hire people to now complete the work that he abandoned, and found out that he significantly underbid pretty much all 20 jobs. And so I was going to need to finish all of these jobs without much construction knowledge, and they were all going to cost anywhere from $25,000 to $75,000 more than what he bid on all of them. $25,000 to $75,000 times 20 jobs. Do the math. It was a lot of money. And behind the context of all of that happening, for those of you who are new to the channel, before I started real estate investing full time, I'd spent 14 years working for a Fortune 30 company, building a comfortable nest egg for my family. And then all of this happened, and it was the most terrifying thing I possibly could have experienced. And so, as you can imagine, I had some anxiety. And there were periods I went through that were very difficult, sleepless nights, lots of worry. Well, the single greatest thing that helped get me through that situation was actually answering all of the questions that were flying through my head. And these are all similar questions that fly through all of our heads when significant anxiety occurs. And these questions are all around the worst case scenario, right? Oh my God, what if this happens? Oh my God, what if I run out of money? Oh my God, what happens if I'm underwater on all of these deals? Oh my God, what happens if everything goes to zero? Everything I have built and worked so hard for the last 14 years, what happens if it all goes out the window because of these decisions that I've made over the past 6 months? Well, naturally, these are all of the types of questions that run through all of our minds when this type of difficulty occurs. And so what I did is I actually wrote each question down when they came to me. And then I actually stopped. And before I asked myself the next freak out question, I wrote down what the answer was. And so what did this look like? I pulled open my notes app on my laptop, and when the question occurred, I would type it out. And then if the next question occurred, I would type that one out too. And then when all of the questions presented themselves, then I went back to the very first one and I wrote out what the answer was. And so what happened if I went to zero? Well, worst case is I probably would have to move into my parents pretty late in my life. It would be kind of embarrassing at the same time. Like, we're all going to be dead soon, and I zoom out far enough, we're like a speck of dust in the middle of a rock and nothing really matters. And so does it really matter that it's embarrassing? Well, probably not. But if I have to move in with my parents, my mom cooks good meals, and we'll have a nice roof over our head, and it would be kind of cramped because my kids would be in there. But that situation would certainly be far from death, which is what it felt like when I at first would ask myself all those questions. And so the point is, once I actually got clarity over what the worst case scenario was, and I realized that I wasn't going to die, and I was then able to focus on what to do next. And that helped me because I was able to focus on what to do next, as opposed to worrying about this vague doomsday of questions that I repeated to myself over and over and over. Leila Hormozi has this quote, and she says, "Fear is a mile wide and an inch deep." And we're so terrified of things. And a big, hairy problem presents itself, or maybe many problems at the same time, and we look out, and there's this vast, stormy, wavy ocean with super dark clouds, and we could see the lightning in the distance. But what happens is when we actually start to wade in the water, we realize that it never goes past our ankles, right? And so it looks big and scary, but when we actually start taking action and walking through despite our fear, we realize that it's actually not that big of a deal. And I've heard her husband, Alex, say something similar. And what I've heard him say is that fear only lives in the vague. Fear does not live in the specific. And what he means is that when we get specific about what will actually occur when worst case scenario happens, we realize that it's not actually that bad. And so when we answer the questions that are giving us the anxiety, well, we realize we're not going to die. And so I told that story to the person who was facing the significant anxiety. And I encouraged her, hey, maybe just try it. It's really helped me in the past. This was my experience. This is what it did for me. Try it. I followed up with her the next day, and she said not only did she try it, but it worked. And when she was done with the activity, she told me that she actually felt physical tightness release from her chest. She had a physiological reaction to doing this activity. And then what I thought was especially cool, she told me at first she tried to do this in her head. So the scary question would approach, and then she tried to answer it in her head. But she was like, you know what? I'm just going to write it down. I'm going to try this thing out. And she said she felt silly when she started to write it down. But after she did, she felt so much better. All of her anxiety disappeared because she got specific about what would actually happen. And she told me she realized that it, actually wouldn't be that big of a deal. And so the lesson there is, if there is something that you want to accomplish, if you have a goal that you're going after, but you have been limited by fear, or maybe you have been, you felt paralyzed with anxiety. Well, you realize that feeling the anxiety doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. And but biologically, for example, we are built for survival. Anxiety has helped us survive in the past. If we went hunting in the jungle with our spears because we were hungry, and if we didn't get food, we were going to die, and we're traversing through the thick bushes and we hear something that we can't see, our body fills with anxiety. And it's that anxiety that actually prevented us from getting eaten by something or killed by who knows what in the middle of the jungle. And so anxiety serves the purpose of keeping us alive. But in today's civilization, in today's safety, where it's unlikely we're actually going to die when we feel significant anxiety, we must learn how to act despite feeling the anxiety. And that means that we don't need to try to suppress it. We don't tell ourselves that something is wrong with us because we feel it. Maybe it also means that we don't need some medication that a doctor tells us that we need because we have anxiety, because something is wrong with us because we're feeling consistent anxiety. But instead, we confront it head on by actually answering the questions that give us the most fear. And it's because when we answer them, we realize that we're actually not going to die. And you know what? At the end of the day, when I push through this difficult situation or this uncertain situation, I'll actually probably have a really cool story to tell. And that's another thing that's helped me through periods of uncertainty, is just knowing that as long as I don't give up, this is going to make for a really cool story one day. And so that was the first kind of emotional situation that occurred, and I thought had a good lesson embedded. The other emotional situation that occurred this past week was when I went to hire a new vendor. And I'm not going to identify the vendor. You know, I bet he's actually a good human being. He seems like a decent dude. And I've heard that the work he does is pretty good. But I'm not going to work with him because he got incredibly emotional, and here's what happened. A friend of mine referred him to me. I had a need. What he does fulfilled that need. And he gave me a quote first thing. And from the very, very beginning of my interaction with him, he very clearly wanted the communication vehicle between us to be via phone call. And that doesn't work well for me for a number of reasons. But, you know, in a quick side note on just phone calls in general, I have a controversial belief on phone calls. It's actually one of my biggest pet peeves when people call me unannounced. And I know I'm weird. That's fine. But I perceive calling me the equivalent to showing up at my house, bursting through the front door, completely unannounced, and demanding that I immediately stop what I'm doing to give that person attention. And sometimes it actually comes across like a little conceited to me for someone to actually believe that I'll just drop everything I'm doing and give them all the attention that they're so rightfully asking for. And what's funny too is I'm actually very conscientious of this when I am making outbound phone calls. And as a result, I very rarely make outbound phone calls. I usually text people, hey, is it a bad time for a quick call? And then let them respond when it's convenient for them. And then assuming that we can both connect, we connect. Anyways, I know I'm a weirdo, but I returned his call and even explained to him like, hey, I have a lot happening in my business. I'm giving my clients a lot of attention right now. I'm probably not going to be able to answer the phone much. And, you know, text communication is going to be better for me. Anyways, we continue, and his behavior doesn't change. He keeps calling. And then there was one day where, I think I had like back-to-back seller appointments, and then there was a lot of phone calls. Anyways, he called me in the morning. I didn't answer, and I hadn't got back to him, and it was like late afternoon, and he called, and he actually called twice, and the second time he left a voicemail basically saying how, you know, now he's very uncomfortable. I've made him very uncomfortable because of my lack of communication, and because of his discomfort, he's going to have to charge a deposit for his thing, and blah, 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 blah. And I was actually pretty annoyed. Even though I was annoyed, I still took time to call him and actually listen to his concerns. And I even summarized them back to him so that he knew that I understood what his concerns were. And he even confirmed that I understood them appropriately. But even then, he just continued to be very emotional, and I simply just ended the phone call. And I haven't talked to him since. And the worst part about this entire situation, I frequently need his services. His business solves my problem. I have money to pay him, and my problems solve his problems. And we're not going to work together simply because he's emotional. And, you know, quick side note, I thought the situation was so weird, so odd, especially the person who sent me him as a referral. I trust wholeheartedly. And so it very, very much caught me off guard. I went to do some research, found the Google page of his vendor business, very promptly saw him very publicly emotionally dumping to negative Google reviews. And, it was at that moment that I was like, okay, yeah, I probably have made the right decision. But look, here's the lesson out of this situation. I am sure that all of his emotions are justified due to what has occurred to him previously in his life, whatever it is. In fact, I even asked myself, what would have had to occur to him in his past that makes him act the way that he's currently asking? And when I answered that question in my head, I told myself a story that actually aligned and made sense, and it justified his emotions. But simply because he felt those emotions does not mean that he needs to act upon them. Feeling the emotion is normal. What you do with the emotion is what is entirely within your control. And your outcomes directly reflect what it is that you do. And, I think a framework of how to do this differently, had he simply felt the emotion, simply asked me, hey, what could we do to improve our communication? And I told him, hey, every time you want to talk, just text or you send me a voice text if your hands are full because of what you're doing in your vendor business. And then you text or voice text, hey, is it a bad time for a quick call? Then I could respond when I'm able. And I could call you, the problem would have been solved, and it quite literally could have been that simple. He could have taken all of my money, I could have taken his services, and we could have flew off into the real estate pastures that we're in with rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. And we both would have lived happily ever after. But instead, it's likely I'll probably never hire him for his services. I just don't have the mental bandwidth to spend dealing with someone's emotions when I have enough problems in my own business that require all of my mental energy and attention. And what's interesting, I'm also, like I mentioned, I'm very close with the person who referred him. And I thought the situation was just so strange. I asked my friend that referred him, like, hey, is this normal? This seems so strange. I don't even know what's happening. And he felt really terrible. And it wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't refer the individual anymore. Anyways, it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. If he does a good job, I hope he does refer them. But if he doesn't, then it's only going to negatively impact this person who, got really emotional. And so, anyways, things happen. We feel things. We don't need to ignore the things that we feel. We don't need to suppress them. Maybe we also don't need to take some sort of external medication because we feel the thing, because someone has assessed that we have a problem. We can hold the feelings, we can carry them with us, but they don't need to control what it is that we do. And the more I've realized that I can feel an emotion, I can act despite the emotion, the more I realize that it's actually irrelevant how I feel. I can still move closer to my goals, even if I feel like shit. And so I wanted to share those scenarios with you. I hope you got some value out of that. I think learning how to deal with our emotions and acting despite how we feel is probably one of the most common denominator traits I see in people who are most successful. And at least when I think about business, when I look at people who are most successful in business, sometimes when I see them publicly, it almost seems so far to one extreme, like they're almost robotic. And it's not that they don't feel emotions. They have just learned that they don't need to act on their emotions. And so if you got some value out of this, or maybe you know someone who has just been emotionally charged recently and you think it would help them, send this to them. Sharing this podcast is the one way that it grows. It's actually the only way that this podcast grows is when you share it. And so by helping maybe your emotional mom, brother, sister, friend, it will also help me. And at the same time, we can help all of the peoples out there act despite how it is that they feel. So I love y'all. I appreciate you listening, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.